characteristics. So it says the proportions of his long bones to one another were such as the characteristics of Negroid skeletons. So we have a skeleton of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh during the 3rd dynasty who shows Negroid slash black slash sub-Saharan slash Africanoid features.
But Sudanese style never fade away. I stay reppin', man, as D-boy. I'm all about Sudan and that's what I enjoy.
Hello guys, welcome to another video. In this video we're going to be talking about race and the ancient Egyptians, okay? Race and the ancient Egyptians and this whole Western notion, this notion that the media tries to show you that only the 25th dynasty had black pharaohs and that everybody else was just Egyptian, this mystery race which nobody knows anything about, and it's just a mystery. Again, nobody knows, or that they were at least European related, or that they were North African, and I'm talking modern day North Africans. And so we're going to be taking a look into some readings that sort of kind of destroy this idea of non-black people ruling Egypt, or black people not really being in Egypt, I should say. All right, so here we're looking, it says critique of the black pharaohs, theme racist perspectives of the Egyptian and Kushite slash Nubian interactions in popular media. Now, a lot of the times in popular media, if it's mentioned, especially by the National Geographic, right? This was mentioned by someone called Akala. He called out National Geographics by saying that they only brand the Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty as the black pharaohs. That's how they brand them. They brand them as the black pharaohs, as if they were the only pharaohs that could have been black in ancient Egypt, which is completely and utterly ridiculous in my personal opinion. But however, it's my personal opinion. But now we're going to take a look at some of the facts and some reading. So first it says 2 recent documentaries promote a black pharaohs theme in which the Kushite rulers overthrew the superior Egyptians and ruled Egypt, the 25th dynasty. But the Egyptians later erased the reign from history. This narrative undergirds the rise of black pharaohs produced by National Geographic's and Lost Kingdoms of Black Pharaohs by Science Channel. The article argues that these documentaries employ the use of presentism, the imposition of current perspectives and attitudes to depict and interpret past events. The 2 documentaries highlight fascinating archaeological finds in the Nile Valley while also reconstructing how discredited views on race and ancient Egyptian slash Kushite interactions arising in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Egyptologists, Petrie, Smith, and Reisner advanced the theory that that dynastic Egypt emerged from the migration of a white race into the Nile Valley, bringing in the elements of civilization superior to that of the indigenous blacks, aka Nilotics and Cushitics. While these documentaries condemn Reisner's racist views on Kush, they largely accept this theory on Egypt's origins and transfer this thinking onto ancient Egyptians. These documentaries ignore the archaeological evidence showing that Egypt and Kush have shared origins and that ancient Egyptian civilization arose from pastoral Neolithic cattle-based culture encompassing northern Sudan and much of the ancient Northeast Africa. Craniometric studies and non-metrical studies of cranial and dental traits demonstrate a close relationship between ancient Upper Egyptian and Lower Nubian populations. Also demonstrate population continuity in Egypt from pre-dynastic phases into dynastic era. Presentism in documentaries use current racial constructs to interpret Egyptian Kushite interactions. For example, the oppressive relationship between the colonizer and the colonized that characterized European colonialism was assumed to apply to ancient Egypt during its colonization of Kush. This review article highlights archaeological findings that challenge these views of Egyptian and Kushite relationships. Examples of Kushite influences on Egyptian cosmology are presented to demonstrate millennia of cultural exchange between the two. Ancient Egyptians did not think of race as presented in these documentaries. Pharaohs from earlier dynasties shared phenotypic features with Kushites considered black by current criteria. So basically, what you guys have just read, or what I've just read to you guys, is that basically views that have been put on by racist archaeologists and racist media and current race interpretation by the Western world have been put on to ancient history where this may not apply as neatly. Now, if you guys look at my race, phenotype, racism, and prejudice video, I get into that topic a little bit deeper. But based on society that you grew up and based on black people having different phenotypes as a whole, it's silly to sort of assume that the Egyptians were not black and the Kushites were black because of certain distinctive phenotypical traits, because not all black people have the same phenotype. So the point I'm trying to make here is that just because an Egyptian could seem different from a Kushite doesn't mean an Egyptian can't be black, and so on and so forth, because different races have different sub-phenotypes. Okay, so that is number one. So now we're going to take a look into some of this stuff. So here we're going to look at studies on ancient crania from Northern Africa. So it says historical sources and archaeological data predict significant population variability in mid-Holocene Northern Africa. Okay, multivariate analysis of crania demonstrate wide variation, but also suggest an indigenous craniometric pattern common to both late dynastic northern Egyptian and coastal Maghreb region. Both tropical African and European metric phenotypes, as well as intermediate patterns, are found in mid-Holocene Maghreb sites. Early southern pre-dynastic Egyptian crania show tropical African affinities, displaying craniometric trends that differ notably from the coastal northern African pattern. The various craniofacial patterns discernible in North Africa are attributable to the agents of microevolution and migration. So the key things I want to sort of highlight, obviously, is the tropical African affinities, right? The tropical and African affinities and European phenotypes. So to keep it as conservative as possible, I do have sort of a documentary or a big video that's going to explain race in ancient Egypt and the ancient world to the T. But essentially, we'll just go the conservative route and say, yes, ancient Egypt was a mega civilization, very diverse, and to keep it real, this is an example of what people would call indigenous Northern Africans. Now, we can see that there is, right here it says that there are tropical African affinities, which means basically black people, sub-Saharan Africans. So that's one thing we got to get out the way. So this basically, I've shown this to sort of show you that black people were not absent from ancient Northern Africa, as many people have tried to push forward nowadays, especially when people say that sub-Saharan Africans never could have gotten any northern than the Sahara because of the weather, which is climate, which is completely false, because right here we have the evidence through craniometric analysis that Africans were definitely present and not absent within Northern Africa. Now, we're going to look into a different reading. It says, exploring Northeast African metric craniofacial variation at individual level, comparative study using principal component analysis. Right? So now we're going to take a look at this. It says, a principal component analysis was carried out on male crania from northeast quadrant of Africa and selected European and other African series. Individuals, not predefined groups, were the units of this study, while nevertheless keeping group membership in evidence. The first principal component seems to largely capture size variation in crania from all the regions. The same general morphometric trends were found to exist within the African and European crania, although there was some broad separation along the line. Anatomically, the second principal component captures predominant trends denoting a broader to narrower nasal aperture combined with a similar shape change in the maxilla, and inverse relation between face base lengths, projections, and base breadths. Excuse me for my reading. And decrease in the anterior base lengths relative to base breadths. The third principal component broadly describes trends within Africa and Europe, specifically a change from combination of a relatively narrower face and longer vault to one of a wider face and short vault. It shows the northeast quadrant Africans along decline with other Africans. Stated in relative terms, northeast Africans tend to exhibit narrower bases in relationship to more projecting faces and more nasal and broader nasal areas than European, although there is a range of variation. Relative to the other African groups, they have narrower nasal areas and narrower faces in relationships to vault length. The crania of northeast quadrant of Africa collectively demonstrate the greatest pattern of overlap with the Europeans and other Africans. Variation was found to be high in all series, but greatest in African material as a whole. Individuals with different geographical regions frequently plotted near each other, revealing aspects of variations at the level of individuals that is obscured by concentrating the most distinctive facial traits once used to construct types. The high level of African molecular diversity found in Africa, these results, coupled with Y chromosome studies, may help generate hypotheses concerning the length of time in which recent craniometric variation emerged in Africa. Okay, very, very long. So it's basically more craniometric studies done within the Northern Africa and showing, again, we have an African presence, and that, showing that there is sort of seems to be an overlap within the craniometric look or detailing of the North and East African people. So now taking a look right here, we're going to take a look into Northeast Africa. This is a look into my presentation. Looking at the Nilotic phenotype, this is a point that I made in my Nilotic history presentation, is that the geographical distribution of the Dinkaid phenotype actually extends far into Egypt, showing that there is evidence. This is one piece of evidence. It's not all evidence, but there is some sort of evidence and some sort of relationship between Nilotic people, who, again, are very related because Nilotic people are people indigenous to the Nile Valley. So this is one thing to keep in general, to keep in mind. Now here we're gonna look, and basically we're looking at a study that shows, if you look at the far right, basically it's looking at a study comparing craniometric studies. It's a craniometric study comparing Mesolithic Nubians to ancient Egyptians, and actually them finding a match and between the Mesolithic Nubians and later Egyptian and Nubian populations, showing that the Nubians, the so-called Nubians, the people of Nubia, the people of the Sudan, has had an influence, a direct influence onto the ancient Egyptians, just like said in the previous article, if you look right here. So this skull, which they found in Egypt, that dates back to 35,000 to 30,000 years ago, while looking at the crania of this skull, by looking at the skull, they suggest that this skull is a person of Negroid morphology, as they said. I'm quoting right there. African skull suggested of Negroid morphology, which means, again, there is evidence for black people inside, or people we call today as black people inside of Egypt. Okay, and it's not just the 25th Dynasty. Now, for those of you guys know, this is basically a study of a pharaoh. Let me see if I can find his name here. The bones of Hen Nekhet, an Egyptian king of the 3rd dynasty. So this is the 3rd dynasty. This is during Old Kingdom time period, okay? We're going to take a look. And basically, we could read through this whole thing, but I really want to highlight the part where they say he has Negroid characteristics. So it says the proportions of his long bones to one another were such as the characteristics of Negroid skeletons. So we have a skeleton of an ancient as the characteristics of Negroid skeletons. So we have a skeleton of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh during the 3rd dynasty who shows Negroid / black / sub-Saharan / Africanoid features and connections. They make the parallels. And so I do have to make one thing clear, and it's that, well, the 25th dynasty was not the only black dynasty, and the 25th dynasty wasn't the only time that black people have touched Egypt. Okay, it wasn't the only time there is. So now, hopefully, after going through what I just went through with you guys, hopefully you guys have been educated, okay, and you might avoid making certain claims that people make, and you can spot the frauds or spot people who like to deny history. Now, I'm not in any way trying to rip away heritage, okay? I actually believe this is also my heritage as a Nilotic man. Now, if you guys want to get into that, I do have videos on that titled Nilotic Connections to Ancient Egypt, and I will have many videos up there explaining these connections in detail. As I like to say, I am an indigenous person to the Nile Valley. This is where my people are indigenous to the Nile Valley. So, with all this stuff taken into regard, it is very, very important to take these claims seriously and to really take a bit of a deeper look into these claims. Presentations I recommend watching where they called out the National Geographics and the Western world for labeling the 25th dynasty as the Black Dynasty. A good lecture I would advise most of you guys to watch is Akala's lecture from Oxford Union. Okay, it was made a couple years ago. It's really great lecture and just really opens your eyes a bit. So with that being said, guys, if you guys like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share this video with anyone who you think might need to know about this, and definitely be sure to maybe have a conversation with someone about this within the comment sections. You can share your research. If you want a place where you can really have good conversations and research, you can definitely hit the link in the description to my Discord server of the New Sudan. With that being said, guys, I'm out. Enjoyed teaching y'all for today.